Hello and welcome to another edition of Tech Launch in the News. Let's get into it. How are AI and machine learning being used in DevOps today? Let's start there with our DevOps in the News. This was essentially a podcast with these four guests. And you can see if you dive right in that one of the key discussion points is around the fact that DevOps is a cultural practice. It's something that we talk about a lot in the DevOps in the News. In general, though, it truly is a collaboration around shared objectives of quality software that's delivered reliably, rapidly, and repeatedly. Now, with that in mind, there are some big opportunities with AI and machine learning for DevOps. But basically, the key takeaway from this kind of starting salvo of this podcast is that DevOps equals a culture aligned around a shared objective. And then the question should really be, how can AI and machine learning help support those shared objectives? So as we set the tone with this podcast in that way, a lot of this discussion was around how essentially a lot of folks several years ago thought that, okay, we have automated all of our processes, we put AI into DevOps, and now in the ideal scenario, all you have to do is press a button and all of your problems are over. Now, that tends to be a lot of the messaging that can occur with a very high potential technology that can be disruptive, but is in its nascent stages. And the practical realities of working with it and implementing it aren't yet known. They go on to talk about some of the nuances of that. And one of the interesting conclusions is that there really is this essential beginning to collaboration between development and operations, and the shift is becoming very real. And that's essentially a foundation, that shift where DevOps, development operations, where developers and operations are actually really collaborating and understanding the reasons behind that. That's really giving a foundation for AI and machine learning to be able to contribute from. So what do we see coming out of the Linux Foundation, AI and Data Foundation? This is a throwback to previously in this conversation where they're talking about how there are some major projects from the Linux Foundation and specifically the AI and Data Foundation that is really focused around standards. So the idea behind this discussion is that there have to be foundational elements where everyone understands that DevOps is more of a culture and more of a process of everyone supporting shared objectives. And then once those are known, then it's establishing standards for how AI and generally how security and some of these other key aspects of DevOps can be put into a standard system so that you have this rudimentary discovery around AI, building a packaged or gray box set of implementations that everyone agrees and collaborates on, which then allows the group as a whole, everyone who's engaged in AI, including less initiated, less expert vendors, to begin to truly benefit from AI-based capabilities. So that's really the conclusion of this discussion. It was a pretty interesting discussion overall. If you want to take a look at it, of course, you can get into the weeds and see it. They also have it in video format. But those are some pretty interesting takeaways that essentially, at this point, they're not seeing a lot of seriously system-wide changes that are going to happen with AI until the overall DevOps space is clear on what those standards and shared objectives are. But there certainly is a lot of niche focus where there is a lot of value. So pretty interesting stuff overall. Okay, let's take a look at the next article now. Okay, so this article talks about some of those shared objectives with DevOps, and in particular, making the pipeline transparent and governable. And one of the challenges that we see overall is that the transparency, especially when you get into larger groups, and some of the ability to have a culture of development and DevOps overall that can make choices on their own and can self-govern and have freedom to make intelligent choices based on their context. It really isn't getting a lot of the backfeeding from the feedback loop of the entire business in a really optimal way. So you really have a left hand not talking to the right hand type of situation. Now, this particular podcast goes into a lot of detail, and I've summarized this into some really key takeaways. One of the big things was that As a developer today, what developers do is radically more advanced than what David Williams, who's in this podcast, was expected to do. He didn't have to do continuous delivery. He didn't really have a continuous feedback, and he didn't have the responsibility for testing whilst developing, according to what he's saying. So there was no combined thing. It was very segmented and siloed. Now he's gone on to become the VP of products at IBM Tivoli, a CTO at BMT Software, and CA Technology prior to its acquisition by Broadcom. And so anyway, you get the point. He's really progressed in his career. And when he started out in the trenches, if you will, he didn't have these challenges. It really has matured a lot. And so it's quite complex for anyone who's trying to integrate into this very splintered and detailed set of requirements that developers, DevOps, SecOps, performance ops, everyone has to meet while serving the overall business. And the one thing that I found out there isn't a thing called DevOps that you can put into a box. It's very much based upon a culture and a type of company that you're with. So true. It very much varies based on the company and the company culture. And no matter who you are in the DevOps pipeline, you need to understand what you're doing and why it is. And everybody that's in that team they need to understand their contribution, irrespective of whether they talk to each other. And he's saying that he thinks that's really, really important, which means that technology supporting that needs to have context. And in general, the organization has to understand that commitment to that consistency and that foundational level of context that needs to exist so that folks can, as he goes on to talk about later, essentially have fragmented roles, have transiency with team members in different roles, and not have to worry about siloing of information and information leaving when someone leaves the company, but rather have the actual infrastructure and the culture essentially document things for everyone and make it intuitive enough so everyone understands the context. Very interesting perspective. So he says it really requires governance to be much more abstract, but end-to-end be an end-to-end thing as opposed to each individual staying as its own practice or each group staying as its own practice. So governance today is starting to move to a point where one person needs to see the end-to-end pipeline and understand what is exactly going on, who is doing what, where, and how, and who has permissions and access, what are the configurations that are changing, etc. And then essentially be in a position where they can help the entire group understand all of that. And you can see he's thinking out loud to some extent as he's going through this, but some other key points I wanted you to get from this are, he says, so as you are part of a team, each team member should have responsibility for this overall thing, and you need to be able to provide the business with the things that they need to make sure that nothing goes awry and nothing has been breached, etc. No security issues occurring, no configurations are not tracked. And then how do you do that? So he's got this concept that's building essentially in this interview around the idea of being able to have a central view and a central visibility into what's going on. So then essentially this is the conclusion of this interview from my perspective, of course. He's saying, if people leave, what do you do? Do you go and get all the other developers and try and debug and translate what that person who left did and how it worked? Wouldn't it be cool instead to have a set of tech that you could understand what the different platform configuration tools did and how they applied, so you can look at it in a more consistent form? And it doesn't stop them using what they want, but the layer basically says, I know, I've discovered what you're using, I've translated how it's used, and I'm now enabling you to model it in a way that enables everyone to use it. So this is a very general set of thoughts, but you can pragmatically see how in a number of years, this is something to target toward moving into. And the idea is that whenever an individual is responsible for a lot of the tactical elements, not necessarily the governing decisions, but the tactical elements of a certain part, that can be very troublesome to an organization. Probably pointing out the obvious, but generally speaking, these are some things that you're seeing in DevOps around how things are quite complicated and very, very challenging to get new individuals to ramp up on. And this is creating a lot of barriers. So you're going to want to make technology selections, not just based on technical capability, but also based on what everyone can learn. So you need a common denominator that's reasonable and realistic. Okay, let's take a look at the next article. Okay, this article talks about environments as a service, or EaaS, EaaS. And the idea here is that DevOps teams absolutely spend a ton of time building and maintaining their development environments. And they are doing very critical tasks to set these different environment up so they can meet certain testing criteria. And they really don't have enough time to do this and do everything else that they need to get done. So there's a new push in the software industry to provide environments as a service, or EaaS. And that would ideally remove a lot of the logistical aspects of setting these environments up. So what a cool thing to be able to do. And this really flows into a lot of what you see with containerization and virtualization, and being able to use tools like Kubernetes, Docker, etc., to be able to set these type of environments up in a service type of way. Time is money, and in this case, lost time costs money. And in this particular article, they're saying that they estimated the total cost of managing environments exceeded $45 billion annually, and release delays cost organizations millions of dollars every year. So the big takeaway here is that if you want to become EaaS ready, you can essentially focus on these three key metrics: using infrastructure as a code, and then containerizing custom code. And I just mentioned that earlier. That's probably the big takeaway here, is containerization. And then finally, thinking carefully about how environments will behave when they are created dynamically. So atomizing different parts of the actual services, APIs, thinking about config variables. So they talk about host names and trying not to hard code variables that are environment specific. These are things that you can do now that will really help with this progression toward containerization and atomizing everything and making it more individually independent, but still able to collaborate and work within the overall cohesive core. Okay, let's take a look at the next article. Okay, so this article talks about the 5 foundational DevOps practices of leading teams. And this was taken from a Splunk research where they essentially did a survey of leading organizations that use DevOps. And you can go look at that research in detail here. The definition of DevOps, as they state it, and then essentially they go into these 5 key areas. So the first big one is monitoring and alerting are configurable by the team operating the service. So this is pretty interesting. And they talk about some of the 3 key performance indicators that folks should focus on. So key system metrics. They give examples: latency, response time, resource utilization. A majority of respondents say they expose those. Business objectives derives from system metrics. So this is something that less actually do. About a third of them actually provide response time as a proxy for customer satisfaction, for example. And then on-demand access to real business metrics, such as time on site, application opens, customer signups, revenue rates, etc. And only a fifth, or 20% of respondents, actually monitor that. So one of the things that you can see here as a trend is getting it to this more fully integrated set of business data isn't something that most businesses do with their alerting and metrics. So having this context and having this culture is a mechanical challenge that you can see from this survey. The business data isn't making it back to the development team, to the DevOps team. So how are they supposed to have these great context type of working environments if they don't even have the data? They're not even exposed to it. So something to think about within the DevOps side of things and the business side of things as well. One of the other kind of key metrics that they talk about is day-to-day service questions that are really helpful to spark some of these internal discussions. Can customers buy from us? How many people are we serving? How much money are we making? And is this pattern normal? Does the new release do what we expected? Does it drive better business outcomes? And how does its business impact compare to the other version? So these are great questions to drive some of that internal discussion. The second big area is talking about improving essentially reuse and making it so that application development overall has less confusion, and that you can essentially use repeatable patterns and have some opinionation about these patterns within your organization, so that you're not having to redo basic things that aren't really providing a lot of additional value within the organization. The ability to reuse testing patterns for building applications. This is pretty interesting because as one of the survey results, they're effectively talking about sharing testing practices. This is an often overlooked area within most organizations because effectively to get to testing, you have to get all the other pieces right before testing is seen or perceived as essential. But unfortunately, as you can see from these results, that is pretty bad as a bias, as a default. So they talk about including QA team members when developing the testing patterns. So right out of the gate, including QA, prioritizing solving the issues that are closest to production first. So being very pragmatic, and then don't assume you can reuse all testing practices. So whenever you're trying to do reuse, be reasonable about it. Testing in pre-production, I want to talk about this for a minute. It's much, much easier than testing in production. So the idea is that you get a pre-production environment, and that pre-production environment simulates production, but it doesn't have, of course, the gravity of being in production, having to meet during off hours or work on things during off hours, that kind of a thing. And then you may not want to tackle the challenge of creating reusable testing patterns until later in the process. Most organizations prioritize deployment practices first and then roll out testing later. So you can see that's just the necessity of the beast with DevOps and the reality of getting software delivered. Teams contribute improvements to tooling provided by other teams. Now, this is, again, kind of a progression as the organization evolves. But this report finds that the ability to contribute improvements to tooling provided by other teams stands out as a key foundational capability. And you can almost see this as a reflection of other things being in place and stable, because once they are, then it's a lot easier for folks to share ideas and normalize those as a cultural thing. But you have to be able to have your oxygen mask on first before you can do that. So again, this would be more of a progression. And then finally, configurations are managed by a configuration management tool. And this talks about how a lot of the respondents really note that this was a core philosophy of DevOps originally. And it really has been emphasized and re-emphasized as a lot of folks have moved to the cloud. And the importance of having this complexity simplified with a modern deployment process. So ultimately, what we want you to take away from this is that there's a progressive process for realizing some of these key takeaways. And one of the biggest aspects that can really help with your organization is this cultural adoption and getting the data, both from the development side of things and from the business side of things, and getting that information consistently in front of everyone so that they can get that feedback loop going. And then that tends to build this stability within your organization that you can then build on some of these other best practices once you have that baseline in place. Thanks for watching this edition of Tech Launch in the News. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe so you can see more in the news resources. We also have complimentary masterclasses and other resources available to you on our website, www.gotechlaunch.com. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them in the comments section. And until next time, thanks for watching and bye for now.